I'm Jonathan Larson with TYTI Investigates, and Congress right now is in the middle, if you didn't know, of negotiations over what the next, possibly final, coronavirus relief package might look like. And the House has already passed a pretty sweeping bill quite a while ago. So the onus right now is on the Senate, which is controlled by the Republicans. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has already been outspoken about what he wants in the bill, which they unveiled yesterday. One of the key components is what they call liability protection. That's a euphemism. What it means is that if someone gives you coronavirus, specifically a business, you no longer have the right to sue them. In other words, they're protected, businesses are protected from having any liability for irresponsible, negligent, careless conduct that causes you to get coronavirus and possibly die. McConnell, I want to share some of the details about who's behind this language getting into the bill that we actually reported on a couple months ago. So I'm offering a little bit of a flashback here, but in conjunction with new news about it. The upshot here is that McConnell is saying he will not pass any relief. He will not allow the allocation of funds for people who are literally going hungry because they are out of work, either because the business they're working for is shut down or because it is not safe to go to that place of employment. And by the way, this also applies to customers. You walk into a store and their knuckle-dragging, non-mask wearing manager comes up to you and coughs in your face and you get coronavirus, you can't sue them, according to McConnell. So Politico has a good piece out today by Eleanor Mueller, talking about what are the actual facts behind coronavirus litigation, right? Is the threatened epidemic, that's the word McConnell used, epidemic of litigation, serious enough to warrant taking away the fundamental American right to seek redress in court, right? We all say, oh, suing is bad. We shouldn't be overly litigious, all of that. And you can make a case that some people file lawsuits you don't want them to. By the way, same thing happens with speech, right? We don't talk about being an overly speechy society because we all understand that free speech means people get to say things that you don't think they should say, you don't think merits saying, any of that. So the same dynamic applies for litigation. You might not agree with the lawsuit. You might think people are filing a lawsuit for a bad reason, but it's a fundamental American right to seek justice in court. So the open question is, how real is the threat that this right, this fundamental right that Americans have, and non-Americans, anyone in the country, how real is the threat that arises from this freedom? Politico writes that 3,727 cases have been filed, lawsuits have been filed. 3,727 cases have been filed since March. Of that number, only 185, that's less than 5%, fall into the category of personal injury that McConnell is talking about. Most of those 3,700 and change coronavirus lawsuits deal with insurance claims and civil rights, meaning people challenging stay-at-home orders, right? Do you see McConnell or the Republicans out there saying, you know what, we have to end these lawsuits, we have to strip Americans of the right to sue so that they don't have to wear a mask, right? If you're really worried about an epidemic of lawsuits, apparently that's where you should be focusing your attention. According to Politico, labor law experts and advocates say that this rate of filing, fewer than 5%, is relatively low, considering that more than 4 million cases, and we're closing in on 4.5 now, have been reported in the U.S., and 150,000 people have died. It was 145,000 when they wrote this article. So addressing the idea that it's not really the number that matters, is Joel Griffith, a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, the conservative think tank, funded, of course, by big corporations and rich people. Griffith tells Politico, quote, "It's not so much the number as it is just the very threat. In other words, it doesn't matter whether there's a lot of them. We just don't like that anyone can do it." Quote, "Regardless of the number of lawsuits that have been filed, having this liability protection in place is still essential to giving business owners the peace of mind they need to operate in a time like this. So you don't get to have the right to seek justice in court if someone's behavior gives you coronavirus because they need peace of mind. So if you're not clear on that, their peace of mind is over, your safety and legal rights are down here. That's literally how it works here. Business owner peace of mind, human beings, safety, and legal rights. The Senate Republicans' language, according to Politico, says that employers could only be held liable if they didn't make, quote, reasonable efforts to follow public health guidelines and if they engaged in gross negligence or willful misconduct that caused an actual exposure to coronavirus. In other words, the Republican bill says that, yeah, okay, fine. You can be sued if you deliberately try to give someone coronavirus. That's where their standard is. Now, Democrats and even some Republicans are now looking at the possibility of sort of a trade-off, saying, you know what? We'll grant you legal liability if you follow a new set of federal guidelines. So if you agree, you, the Republicans, agree to let us establish a new, actually enforced set of federal guidelines, then we'll give you liability for people who meet those standards. We'll protect you legally if you do the right thing. Now, at this point, I should weigh in and say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And the reality is, I don't know. Right? It's a little early. We haven't studied this. We don't have to have an opinion on everything right away. I might even argue that having an opinion on everything immediately is a bad thing. So here's what Senator Patty Murray of Washington, who's the top Democrat on the Health Committee here, says. She says that having a federal standard would actually help employers. So, quote, they know what they need to do. And here's a really important point about federal standards. When in the case of regulations, it turns out that businesses don't really necessarily always want regulations to be made easier and easier. Usually what they want is just predictability. Just tell us what it's going to be, and then let us keep that and operate under that, because it's the unpredictability and the not knowing from year to year what the standards are going to be that causes them dismay. Murray says, quote, they don't want an environment that makes them less competitive if they're doing the right thing. What they want is standards so that everybody can live up to the same standards and make sure workers are protected. In other words, businesses wouldn't necessarily be hurt by having a federal standard, because if they were inclined to do the right thing on their own, now this means that everyone else will have to as well. It really only impacts the bad actors here. And it helps the good actors by forcing their competition to play by the same rules. Another aspect here that's important to note is that if these liability protections were put in place, that would disproportionately impact, it would disproportionately exacerbate racial inequities. Why? Because the workers who are on the front lines of these businesses are disproportionately non-white workers, right? Not to mention lower wage workers. Those are the people whose legal rights we're talking about here, which means the existing racial inequities would be made even worse with this liability protection in place. Okay, so Democrats are saying, no, they're not going to do this. McConnell is saying he's not going to allow this to pass without those protections. So theoretically, they're at a standoff. This idea of impose a federal standard and then we'll allow liability protection for everyone who meets it, that's a compromise. It's around out there that has some bipartisan support, and you don't have to like that compromise. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to oppose it. I'm a little unsure. I'd like to hear what the experts have to say about it. But before we even get to the notion of whether this compromise is worth it, I want to address how we got here. Why is it that if only 185 cases out of 3,700 filed, that's less than 5%, only 185 cases have even been filed with more than 4 million people infected? Why is this considered a significant enough problem that the majority leader, Mitch McConnell of the United States Senate, is willing to hold up the entire new package of economic relief for hungry people, for unemployed people, for sick people? Why would he be willing to do that for an epidemic that has only struck 185 people or 185 lawsuits? I actually forgot I did a story back in May that were publicly saying, coronavirus, we've got your back, meaning America, we've got your back. We know, America, that you're going through hard times, and we've got your back, America. Well, behind America's back, what some of these companies were also doing was funding, bankrolling, lobbying efforts to remove your legal rights. So the public, fuzzy, heartwarming music videos that they put out said, America, we've got your back. Behind the scenes, up in the corporate offices, they were spending more money, most likely, on lobbying Washington to create exactly this, right? The thing that McConnell wants to enact here, which is liability protection, aka stripping your legal rights, that thing is exactly what we reported back in May that these companies were lobbying doing. But it's not faceless lobbyists. It's not just any lobbyists. They have to disclose who they are. So we dug in a little bit to find out which companies were doing the lobbying and who were the actual lobbyists. Now, a lot of the lobbying gets done through the United States, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which purports to be purely a business organization, but is very much right-wing ideological in a way that your local Chamber of Commerce most likely is not. And the way it works is that big corporations can cut massive checks to the Chamber of Commerce and not have to disclose it if they don't do it as a charitable donation. So we know very little about who actually funds the Chamber of Commerce, but we do get glimpses occasionally. There are SEC filings where it might come out. Sometimes it comes out in a lawsuit, that kind of thing. So sometimes the companies actually list it on either their tax filings, if it's done through a charitable donation. Sometimes that comes out through the foundation's tax filings. And sometimes the companies themselves say, we support charities like blah, 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 and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce lobbyists, who are they? Well, some of them are people who used to work for, I hope you're sitting down, Mitch McConnell. Among the lobbyists, I'm quoting my own reporting from May here. I hope that's not an obnoxious thing to do. Among the lobbyists working on the stimulus bills, private right of action issues, that's what it's called. A private right of action basically means your right as a private individual to take action in court. Among the lobbyists working on these issues for the U.S. Chamber were G. Hunter Bates and Casey Higgins. Bates was McConnell's chief of staff. Higgins worked for the former Speaker of the House, Republican Paul Ryan. Other lobbyists on this beat also included Ryan Thompson, former chief of staff and press secretary to Republican Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma. Another of these lobbyists was Jeff Verhoff, who was a vice chair of the Republican National Committee's Finance Committee. The Chamber's Institute of Legal Reform is its arm that engages in a lot of this activity. The executive vice president of the Institute is John Abegg, Mitch McConnell's former chief lawyer, now a registered lobbyist. So what we have here basically is we have corporate America admitting it's not even so much about the numbers. It's just about they don't like the threat. They don't like the concept. They want peace of mind. Here's the thing to understand about peace of mind. That is not what you want in the people whose actions determine whether or not other people live or die. If you're not familiar with the Pinto case and the Pinto lawsuit, back in the 70s, I think it was the 70s, might even have been earlier. This was Ralph Nader in his heyday. The Pinto essentially would blow up and kill people. And the legal principle that sort of became clarified out of this case was that you should not have caps, mandatory ceilings on how much a jury can award a company that kills. If you told a company, if you passed a law, let's say, that said, you know what, if you blow up your customers, you'll have to pay a fine of as much as $5 million, but no more. What would happen then was the companies would then make a calculation. They'd get out their calculator and figure out, if I blow up my customers, I'll make $6 million in profits, but I might have to pay $5 million in fees. Well, even if I have to pay $5 million in fees, I still get $1 million in profits. So you know what? Let's go blow up some customers. If you take away the concept of a cap, and now a company says, you know what? If we blow up our customers, there's no way of knowing whether the jury might be so angry at us that they bankrupt us with their verdict. So we won't do it. That is the point of removing legal caps. And that's essentially the same dynamic that we're seeing here. And just a little bit of background, just the sort of meta narrative here. We talked a little bit about the fact that big corporations obviously are funding this. The Republicans will say that the reason Democrats are opposed to this is that trial lawyers, the people who get hefty, settlements and get a piece of those settlements, are very big Democratic donors. So the Republican argument is that Democrats are doing it for the same reason, for donations from rich trial lawyers. So whether you agree with that or not, that's up to you. But in the interest of fairness and intellectual transparency and honesty, I wanted to share that information. So I see we have a lot of people watching, but for some reason, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So I don't know if the chat is busted or whatever, but I apologize that I'm not able to see anything. And normally we do these so that I can take your questions and everything, and yet I'm not seeing anything. So I'm not sure what to do about that, guys. I'll tell you what, I'll ask you, I'm going to open up another window so I can see what you guys maybe are saying in the comments, or maybe I can see it in the chat in that separate window. So let's see. Okay, now I can see the chat. Sorry. I don't know why. Yeah, in the window where I'm streaming, it's not showing me the chat. So I opened a new window. And Melanie Dennis says, among all the other issues going on, this is going to be a long fight, but it needs to be done. Jeffrey Cayley says the Dems always cave. Well, they don't always cave. I understand why you would say that, and they definitely sometimes cave, right? I mean, we're seeing some really depressing reports coming out about the platform vote for the Democratic National Platform. They're definitely caving to stuff there, and they're not even in a fight with anyone except other Democrats. So do Dems cave? Yes. Do they always cave? No. And the reason I say that is not to defend Democrats, but if we say that they always cave, that makes it easy for us to give up on trying to make them not cave, right? And we are a factor in when they cave and when they don't cave. If we speak loudly enough, we make it easier for them not to cave or harder for them to cave. Imperator One says the standards for liability exchange is not a good idea because companies often attest to things they're not actually doing or not doing 100% if it's profitable for them. Amen, right? God is in the details here. How would you enforce these standards is a very, very crucial question. Weena Jensen says the unpredictability for the common worker is intentional. D. Scully says, being able to seek justice in court in order to be made whole is a constitutional right and a fundamental necessity for a democracy. You can't have a democracy if the powerful are unaccountable. And that's a great way of putting it, D. Scully, as usual. Thank you. I should add that this notion that they're saying, well, in a time of pandemic, we need to protect business owners so that they can have peace of mind. This remedy that they're seeking for business owners in this time of crisis is exactly what they wanted for business owners before coronavirus, the new COVID-19, was even found. This is what they want for business owners, period, right? If you go back and look, tort reform, that's what they call it, tort reform, tort being essentially a lawsuit, a legal action, has been around for decades as something that they're pushing, right? To talk about they always talk about streamlining or modernizing our court system. What it really means is chipping away at your right to sue. So all that's happening here is classic Naomi Klein shock doctrine stuff. Well, there's an epidemic going on. Well, then on the one hand, we'll relax the regulations that employers have to follow, right? There are OSHA regulations. They've only brought one action against an employer in all of this. So we'll relax the regulations, and then we'll take away your legal right to sue because of the results of those regulations, right? On the one hand, they're arguing, this is a brilliant point I just thought of. On the one hand, they're arguing that employers are already doing everything they need to and should to protect people. But on the other hand, they're lowering the standards for their regulations. The only reason to lower the standards for your regulations is so that employers can take advantage of those lower standards, which means they're not doing everything they can to fight the coronavirus. Tempo Dan says, I honestly think they are trying to sacrifice people by protecting business but doing next to nothing to help people, forcing people to intermingle. It's crazy how cold that is. Tempo Dan says, the powerful have been 99% protected since Reagan. Robert Holcomb says, dump the turd November 3rd and Moscow. Mitch. D. Scully says, without civics, people find themselves arguing the merits of every fundamental necessity of democracy against the freedom of the powerful to extract wealth at any cost, as if that's the common good. DLJ says, this is how a medieval monarchy worked, powerful families versus the masses. Imperator 1 says, as an auditor, the compromise is going to create more work for us and will create pressure on us to either falsify or fudge results because the benefit to the company for compliance is so high. Per in Sweden, whose name I always get wrong, Tyrin, donates 200 Swedish kronor. Thank you so much, Per. And Per writes, the U.S. needs a protection ombudsman, and then gives a Swedish word for it, Skidsombud. I'm saying it wrong, of course. But since the unions, except the police union, are not wanted by the junta, there's a problem since this is a workers' problem. And then says, P.S., love from Sweden. Tack så mycket, Per. Thank you. Weena Jensen says, yes, nothing changes. Power takes on different forms and shapes, but the dynamic remains constant. D. Scully says, is this policy good or bad for democracy? This is the fundamental question that every child was supposed to have been taught in civics to ask when considering any political policy. Weena Jensen says, TYT investigates, I used to adore you until you quoted yourself a minute ago. Well, I knew the risks. D. Scully writes, is refusing to hold the powerful accountable for the harm they cause to the weak good or bad for a democracy? And why? If folks can't answer that question, then it's their obligation to learn. Tempo Dan writes, we need national referendums to direct what Congress votes on addresses each session at a bare minimum. They can vote on side projects too, but bare minimum vote on our referendums. It's an interesting idea. Real Fact says, why would corporations decide to have the welfare of workers at heart? Since when? Check out how they fight to raise wages. Corporations are in business to make money. When did their profits trickle down? The Grateful Heretic says that Noam Chomsky said on Democracy Now! That it may be time for the military to decide whose side they're on. I read that as implying, are they loyal to the Jesuits or the heretics? They must decide. You threw me with the Jesuit reference in there. Grateful Heretic. Imperator One says, in the Pinto case, which was the 60s, I think, the difference in fixing the car was about 5 cents. About 5 cents per car, which just Imperator One writes, but the payouts to families would be $200,000 per explosion. Really cool writes, it's always about the money. U.S. Chamber of Commerce plus Mitch McConnell, as corrupt as it gets. Get him. Imperator One writes, the Chamber of Commerce has been demonizing the plaintiff's bar, meaning lawyers for the people who sue, for decades, and has really hurt us as a profession. Kid of Boot Forever says, I really wish my high school teacher would have explained things in a nonpartisan way, was very Republican and tried to push it on us. I'm teaching my kids to do research and decide for themselves. And Kid of Boot Forever referred to their high school ELPSA teacher, which I confess I don't know what that acronym stands for, which is why I didn't say it in the middle there. So maybe you can clarify for folks, or at least for me. Let's see what else. D. Scully says, Democratic trial lawyers in real life tend to be right-wing. They just care about their own protections, then advocate for all of the other right-wing policies other lawyers do. Worthless. I wasn't aware of that. And then writes, when we speak loudly enough doesn't necessarily mean with words. People need to start speaking with their bodies more. Agitate, shut stuff down, make them a little scared. Tempo Dan asks a really interesting question. How are all the judges that Trump appointed affecting the COVID response and the ability to stand up for workers? Any legal battles to keep an eye on? So there was one that I referred to, at the risk of quoting myself, in the article back in May. The judge in that case kind of tossed it back to Congress, but that was essentially coming down on the side of the corporations. I don't recall whether that judge was a Trump appointee or not, but you know, in a lot of these cases, in theory, you have the opportunity to appeal. But I've also said before, like, we need like a new era, a New Deal level bureaucracy dedicated essentially to clearing out virtually every judge appointed by Trump. Although I will say, I don't think that Trump is uniquely bad in terms of who he's appointed, right? Some of the worst, if you look at some of the rulings from the Supreme Court during the Trump administration, Trump appointed judges have actually got a better track record than some of the Bush appointed and Reagan appointed judges. Okay, with that, guys, I'm going to apologize for my, Rob P says, did I miss the ransom part? Yeah, so the ransom part is that McConnell is saying, I will not give you the relief funds for people who are hungry, out of work, maybe facing homelessness. I will not give you those relief funds unless you agree to liability protection, which means that business owners can give customers and employees coronavirus without even being afraid of being sued, let alone losing. That's the ransom that they're asking. They want our rights in return for our money. So I'm glad, Rob P. Thanks for reminding me to pay off the headline of this. D. Scully says, this is a brilliant point I just thought of, and then says, awesome, JL. I find the best journalists are great active listeners. We get to watch your enlightenment yourself. This is awesome. Well, thank you for that. I was being a little self-deprecating about it because I was thinking, oh, look at my brilliance in action here. But I very much take your point about finding it sort of satisfying and interesting to see someone learn something, right? Which is kind of what I was doing, right? Is learning to see something in a new way. And the example I always give people is back when I worked on Up with Chris Hayes on the weekends at MSNBC. Chris and Elliot Spitzer got into a debate on the air about campaign finance reform, and the same thing happened to Chris. Only in my case, all I did was come up with a point that kind of made sense to me, and I'm not saying I came up with it. I'm saying I got it. In Chris's case, he actually changed his mind. His view was X when he went into the show, and then his view was not X over the course of watching it on TV. And so I know exactly the kind of satisfaction it can bring to see movement like that, to see openness to questioning your own beliefs, the positions that you have. So thanks very much for calling that out, especially in the way you did. And Kiddaboot Forever just kicked in $5 in the super chat. Thanks so much. And writes economic, legal, and political systems in action. Oh, this is the reference to the professor. So this was our teacher. This was an economic, legal, and political systems in action teacher who I guess was pushing Republican ideology. Okay, so oh, that's interesting. Kevin Bailey says my mic sounds better today. I'll have to check the settings on that and see if I can replicate that. Thanks for the mic check, Kevin. And Goku Just Saying says most journalists couldn't even enlighten a light bulb, and directs that at me. So thanks so much. I'm glad that my own epiphanies are of some value to you folks, but I also hope that the information I'm bringing you has some use to you as well. The bulwark of the court is one of the last redoubts, one of the last fortresses, protections that Americans have. The regulatory agencies are off the clock. They're not protecting us right now. I reported about Mount Air, this chicken plant in Delaware. OSHA got a complaint about workplace conditions there and dropped the complaint because they asked the owner of the factory, is this true? And the factory said no. That's what enforcement looks like. Imagine if you called 911 and the cop showed up and you said, that guy mugged me. And the cop said, hey, is that true? Did you mug her? And the guy said, nope, I did not. And the cop says, all right, well, that's good enough for me. Off you go. That's the level of enforcement we have. We have no enforcement. We have judges who, and even this applies to even some Trump, Democrat appointed judges, are corporate leaning anyway. And now we're looking at the last defense. Literally the last defense is, well, if no one else is going to help me, the government won't impose standards, won't enforce standards. No one's going to help me. At the very least, I'm going to get a lawyer and I'm going to go to court. That's your last resort. That's that people should be fighting about right now, because right now is when this argument is happening. And if that's not enough for you, remember what I said earlier, which is this is something they've wanted along for everything. And if they win it for coronavirus, you don't think any other disease is going to be next? And after disease, it's going to be workplace liability, workplace safety issues. They'll just continue to expand it until our legal rights are essentially reduced to nothing unless that's what a limited liability corporation is, right? I didn't even know this. They were practically invented in the 80s. And it's literally about limiting liability. That's the decades-long crusade they've been on, is removing your rights when you're up in conflict against a corporate entity. That's what's going on and has been going on for decades. So even if you're not going to fight the battle, at least let's be aware that it's happening. And right now we're losing. So that's all I got. I guess what I'm saying is, right now, taking care of each other means fighting for this and letting Democrats know that you need them to fight on this as well. And to their credit, they seem to be. They seem to be saying this is a non-starter. But they need help, right? That's our job. Election day is not the Super Bowl, it's draft day. And we're part of the team, and we need to be part of the team every day for our entire lives. The fight, America is a fight. That's the project of being America. So get out there and fight. And remember that doing so is taking care of each other. So take care of each other, take care of yourselves. And now I'll see if I can end the stream since I switched over to the other screen. Thanks, guys. Bye.